We will call this meeting to order. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see the people who know how to brave a little bad weather here. And I was telling Mark Johnson coming over here, the snowflakes when I left the house were about the size of dinner plates, and you couldn't see very far, but we all got here safely, I hope. You all have your agenda in front of you. And
we'll call this meeting to order. Good morning, everybody.
Sounds good. Members, please bear with me. I am Robert's Rules of Order guy. I am not, but some of you are. So let's begin with taking a look at the agenda. Any questions about that at all, or additions, subtractions? You all have it in front of you. And we will review the minutes of our last meeting. Have you had a time to look at those? I would hope. And I need a motion, I think, to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Have a motion to approve, second?
Not necessary.
Not necessary? Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Same sign.
Do you sign it?
All right. That's passed. As usual, we have to ask about conflicts of interest regarding the topics today. If you have any, speak up. If not, we'll move on. And apparently none. And we have the Executive Director's report here. Mr. Johnson, are you ready?
All right. Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oops. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I just got a text from Representative Fabian, who's on the phone with us today. Just to remind you all, we are on live video for the first time for this meeting. And he said there's about a 45-second delay or 40-second delay. So that's why you were hearing yourself. He had the audio on as well. Dan is watching on the video as well as listening on the phone. So members, just a couple things to bring you up to speed on. As you're all aware, Becky Enfield has ended her tenure with our staff, and I just wanted to express for the record our thanks to Becky for her fine work for the years that she was with us, and again, our best to her as she enters the rigors of law school. So thank you, Becky. We are proceeding with LCC to fill that position. It's being posted, and somewhere by the first of the year, we should have somebody on staff, I would think. Just to let you know also from a standpoint of other communications going on, a couple of days ago, actually it was on Monday, the LCCMR Director, Becca Nash, and myself were asked to speak in front of the Clean Water Council, talking about ideas and collaborations between our councils with the funds. It was an interesting discussion. As I understood, the council said I was the first one from the Outdoor Heritage Council or staff to ever come and talk to their council. So that's kind of interesting, and we're 10 years in, or 12 years. We're going to try to increase that communication a bit. In fact, their administrator, Paul Gardner, and LCCMR's Director Nash and myself are going to get together on a regular basis, whether that's going to be monthly or quarterly, just talking about potential collaborations and ways that we can work together, and also opportunities for this council to give input to theirs or theirs to us or whatever it might be. The interesting thing is that there's a lot. In fact, as we look back, there's probably well over $100 million worth of funding from each, the Clean Water Council and the Outdoor Heritage Fund, that have collaborated or simultaneously or in parallel at least funded projects that were the same or had, and we were from the habitat side, they were from the clean water side. So a lot of collaboration between the funds, even if it isn't necessarily diagnosed up front or anticipated to be that way by either council. So good news all the way around. Video broadcasting, I just wanted to say a thank you to the House Information Services Director, Barry LaGrave, for helping make that happen, and to Greg Hubinger, who will be speaking to us after a little bit. He's with LCC, and thanks to him for his assistance. There is a letter in your packets, members, actually an email with a letter attached from Kirk Schnittker, and this was just received yesterday, and that's why it was put in your packets late. You can read the letter at your leisure. The point of interest for us will be with regards to our agenda item number 6. Mr. Schnitker testified, I think, at the last meeting about the Roseau River project and the Roseau Lake project. He has a client with land within that Roseau Lake project area. And as you'll notice on the last page of the email, the second page of the email, it says, we request the time extension be denied, and that's with regards to our agenda item number 6. So just to make sure you know that that is what it's regarding. And of course, number 6, we're going to have information coming in from Randy Prachar, Area Wildlife Manager or Supervisor, on the project and the request for that. The last thing, that is it for my report, unless anybody has any questions. Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Moving to item 5 now, I'm looking forward to because I've always been concerned about we don't blow our own horn enough, and I know a lot of folks frown on that, but we don't have to blow our horn so much as blow the horns of people who are using this money and advancing the cause of our outdoor heritage. And so we have Patrick Thornton, is that?
Patrick Thornton? Yep.
Yeah, Patrick is going to bring us up to date on, as you might remember, Council, we all shared this concern, and so we're looking at how we are communicating and out reaching more of Minnesota taxpayers.
Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Thornton, for being here.
My colleague Danielle Fisher is also here.
Good
Yes,
morning.
Mr. Chair.
If I may interrupt you, thank you,
Please
Mr. Chair. Council members, just to remind you, we had an RFP that we put out a year ago with, and Russell Herder was the recipient, was the grantee or the person that we hired through that RFP. Danielle and Patrick are 2 of their people, and they've been working with us for this last, not quite a year. I think the contract still goes through into December, mid-December, but we wanted to get a good update for you. So here it is. I just wanted to make sure you all had that background, that
And
they've
for the-
been working with us at the blessing of the council.
For the record, just please introduce yourselves.
Sure. Can you hear me okay with the microphone? Okay. Patrick Thornton, Public Relations Director at Russell Herder.
Danielle Fisher, I'm the VP of Operations with Russell Herder.
We are your horn blowers. Okay. Can everyone see okay? So our goals were pretty well stated in the RFP to share timely information about the fund and program accomplishments, put together some tools and templates so we could start a process and then have something running where we wouldn't need to be starting every time there was a new project that we wanted to talk about. We could have some things in place where it would make it a little bit more efficient going forward. The other thing we tried to do was make connections with people that knew about the fund, or people that knew nothing about the fund, people that knew maybe a little bit about the fund but didn't know quite what it did, and then maybe people that knew about the fund and maybe didn't have the most, or maybe didn't have, we could maybe adjust their opinion of it a little bit. And then always with anything we do, we want to monitor it and report on the successes and make sure what we did is working. Those were the targets that were identified. Partners who have requested funds, conservation and outdoor groups, media members and others, and then Minnesotans. And then what I mean by that is people that hunt and fish and people that don't, from International Falls to Albert Lee. We've tried to focus in the beginning on people that we thought were more likely candidates, but not only on that group too, because it's more than just people. Like I said, it's more than just hunting and fishing groups. It's everyone. These were the tactics that we've been using. Media outreach. We're trying to get more people to the website. We started a social media from zero. Some public relations work. We've put together some creative pieces. And then, some of it is just meeting face-to-face, phone calls, emails back and forth with different groups talking about what we can do together. So I'm going to run through some of the creative pieces that we've put together, just sort of that toolkit that I mentioned earlier to show you what we have done so far. An overview of the fund, sort of a one-pager that you could use to leave behind at a meeting. This would be a media guide for that we could use if there was some interest in it, how we effectively talk about these projects, and to prepare people who maybe weren't as comfortable with media interviews. This is sort of an outreach, how we would walk a story idea through the process. Tear sheets of specific profiles, again, to use at community meetings, legislators that would maybe have a meeting in their district and wanted to talk about the fund. We could, spotlight on one specific project. Here was the money. Here, give some data points about maybe acres or how the money was spent, the impact of it. And like all your projects, they lend themselves so well to photos. So we've tried as much as we can to put more pictures behind the work because the pictures can tell the story a lot better than the words can. Here was an award that the Blue Wing Teal Award, so sort of a spotlight on that. We also did a website assessment. Here's these were our goals going into the assessment, just to see how it worked, see how well you showed up on web searches, how your analytics are, look at all your content, and then see if there were some opportunities to make your design a little bit better, to make it more optimal for users. So there's your website. Obviously, you've seen that before. Some of your, we don't really call them competitors because you don't have competitors, but maybe folks that are in the same space as you that we looked at that would come up, for maybe in similar searches. So that's just sort of our base group, I guess. Here are the sort of some of the conclusions that our digital staff drew about it. It's well organized in a hierarchical way. It's in line with a government website. It's mobile responsive, which is very important. It's useful, concise. Some of the accessibility could be improved. If you go back, there's a lot of different tabs. I think probably some of them you're stuck with. So there's, in talking to staff, I know there's some of the stuff you can do, but there's a lot of different points of entry, and it may be a little bit confusing just for a first-time visitor. There are some recommendations that we have in working with staff. I know, though, there are some
Limitations.
yeah, that you have. This is the way people access the site. This is sort of how the different tabs, how it goes, about how far they go down. So one of the things, goal tracking. A lot of our clients you're different than some of our clients because we'll work with people where we get them to their website and we want them to do something, whether it be sign up for a newsletter or buy a mattress. You're not really selling that to the public. So one of the things we talked about with staff is, okay, we're driving people to the website, but then what are our goals for people? What do we want them to do when they get there? And that's, whether it be to learn more about it, to go to a certain tab, to see how they can apply for funding, to go look at some of the program accomplishment pages, to read more about it. Mm-hmm. Your goals are, you don't have to have just one, but one of the ways we can reorganize the website is based around, and it's at the direction of all of us. We have some of our own recommendations, but bringing someone to the website is the first step. The second step is getting them to do something when they're there. Contact form, make it maybe a little bit easier for people to find. How do I apply? Where do I go for more information? And then a call tracking to monitor and record phone calls made through the website is another option. These are the phrases that we used in our analysis. It's a pretty base group. That's where you would come up in a Google search or a Bing search. Land trust, I think I saw them here, there. they have a little bit higher than us, but we've been able to move up your search results through some of this work that we're doing. But also this just goes to show kind of where we are, where we started with. That's one of the search engine optimization, SEO. That's where we think we have some. That's where we think we have going forward. We have some real possibilities to bring the website up to the forefront more, and it's easy because your messaging is it's written down: restore, protect, enhance Minnesota's wetlands, prairies, forests, and habitat. Our website strategy would be built around that sentence, which is that phrase, which is great because we already know what you want people. We already know what you want people to find when they're looking for you. And it's sometimes we have to create it, and for you we don't. There's a few design things we think we could help with. One of the things is more imagery, more photos and videos on the website, more movement. Some of your the competitors that we look at have their social media tabs right there, where it's a little bit more enticing. One of the things we had talked about too was an ADA compliance assessment going forward. I know that's probably something that you've talked about or are familiar with too. I don't know if you've done that audit, but that would be certainly something that we would recommend too. So, excuse me, this shows we looked at March 1st, 2019 versus March 1st, 2018 to see when we got involved, where you were, and where you are now. Sessions, just people that interact with your website, up 11%. Of those, new visitors are up 12. Total visitors are up 9%. Of those, the new visitors are up 12. Visitors from organic search is up 8%. What that means is when someone goes to Google or goes to Bing and enters Lessard-Sams, Outdoor Heritage Fund, legacy amendment, some of those terms that we had in previous slides, that's up 8%. And the best one is you're up 80% from visitors from other websites, which is great. What that means is other partners, the folks they're on, let's say, the Ducks Unlimited page, and they read about how Ducks Unlimited is using Outdoor Heritage Fund dollars for a project. Then there's a link to your website on that page. They click on it and they come back, which is great. That is, one, that's how you build up your SEO, and two, that's one of the things that we set out to do when we first started working was to get the partners to work with us on giving what do I want to say, on recognizing the Outdoor Heritage Fund in helping to support these efforts. So that 80% number is great. I'm proud of that one. So a couple of the other recommendations. There is some old content that we could update or remove altogether. It goes back probably to the beginning of when the legacy amendment passed, that maybe out of date or could be updated. I mentioned the ADA compliance audit. That reevaluate the goals, and then one of the things I was thinking about, just on the way over here, Minnesota has 4 seasons. Winter is maybe the longest one, but with all this great imagery that we have, we could add new photos, add new videos where it is summer. You could focus on that, and then winter, and show the projects throughout the season. Show some of the progress that some of the projects that can go on for years, as you guys well know. It's not a static. It's not static work, and it often isn't work that can be done, in a single construction season. One of the other things we do. Go ahead, sorry,
So
Daniel.
we know we worked quite a bit with staff as they've been evaluating the project image organization already, and so the idea of bringing in more assets means that. Sorry, I need to talk a little louder. So from an image organization standpoint, we really are pushing project managers to be bringing in more imagery of the projects that they're working on, and the organization of that and the tagging of that, making it really intuitive for users to come to the site to check out what's going on, to make it really easy for media to be able to come in and find images of the project project work that you guys are doing is really imperative. And so we had kind of shared some recommendations and how that could look. And I know you guys are already well underway with moving forward with a lot of that.
Yep. And then just also to have a database of photos will help with outreach materials going forward too. And if they're from the project partners, they're free, so you don't have to pay a photographer to go out and shoot them. Okay, so we started when we started, there was no social media presence, and so we started a Facebook account, an Instagram account, and most recently a Twitter account, which I was looking at some of the other legacy funds. Some have, it's kind of a mix. Some have no social media presence at all. Some have some. So but I would say the Outdoor Heritage Fund is on the farther end of, again, some of those, well, for sure in the Legacy Amendment funds, but some of those ones that we looked at earlier that I showed, you're getting a little bit later start to the game than some of the others. So Facebook to date is probably been our biggest channel. We also, our Instagram posts there's likes, followers, engagements. I can share all this media, I can share all this with you too if you'd like. The Twitter just started in November, which is great. We've been able to do a little more sort of real-time interaction with people. And if I had one, I guess, social media recommendation going forward, it would be more cute dog photos, please. Those seem to have done pretty well,
Very well.
so far. Media outreach has been another big one. This fall, we it's two things for media outreach. One, I've focused on explaining how the process and timeline and schedule works. I think some of the people I've talked to are confused how the council makes recommendations for projects, but that doesn't mean that the project will start, right? So just giving people sort of an education on when the money is approved, when does it go out, when can we start seeing it? So sort of an education piece. And then the second piece is just highlighting the work that the partners are doing with the money across the state. And it's been great. The partners that I've worked with have been eager to talk about the successes they've had, have been great to work with, and I couldn't appreciate their enthusiasm, quite frankly, more. I've not had to twist arms or annoy people. They've all been great. Some of the news releases we've done, some of the outlets that we've been in, big, small, north, south, east, and west, daily papers, outdoor papers, and trade publications too. This just shows spikes in coverage that we've had, again, from March to the end to November. We've had some big ones. Again, where you're showing up, mostly in print, some radio, some TV, but mostly in print. This is a word. This isn't interesting for me. Is these are the words that are associated with the Outdoor Heritage Fund. What are people saying when they talk about you? Ducks, land, pheasants, legislature, habitat, wildlife, council, Minnesota, invasive, those kinds of things. And what's good for me is I want to see these positive words. But you don't want to see the rip-off, scam, or those are the words. But so when people are writing about the fund, it's positive that it's associated with. That was the only point of that. Sorry. Some of the examples of where we've been. Again, sort of all over. This fall, we kind of focused on seasonal stuff. So we began with wild rice season. So projects that helped wild rice harvest, moved into birds, upland bird hunting, and then after that into just when the deer hunter opened, or deer hunting opened. Excuse me. So it was a seasonal where money was used on specific things that you could kind of set your clock to, which worked great. Going forward, my next targets are updates on projects to show, okay, maybe there's still a couple of years left to go, but here's where they started, and here's where they are so far. And, yeah, okay. So these are our sort of recommendations for things we can do next. To continue some of the public and media relations outreach that we've been doing. I think tours of projects have been, people have responded to those well, both, there was one I remember at the, that you did with the trout streams in southern Minnesota, but I think more of that, where you bring the public in, you invite media, and it's an educational aspect of what the fund is, what it does, how it works. The more we can do with your partners, I think it maximizes our outreach. We can use some of the stuff that we're doing, and we can double up on efforts. And again, it's free. A lot of them have great assets available that if we can continue to form some of those relationships, I think it'll be beneficial. Video is one that I think would be one of our first recommendations in terms of tactics. We've talked a little bit to staff about some of the plan that we have. You can, once you have a video or videos, you can use it all over and can keep using it. You can cut it to different lengths, and we'd want to make it as sort of evergreen as possible. Again, use existing footage whenever possible to save money. And it can be real simple. It answer these three questions: what is the fund, what does it do, and why is it important? And the storytelling can go from there. We think there's an opportunity for some more creative assets too. Annual reports, spotlights on completed projects, five-year sort of recaps on where the fund is, what the fund has been accomplished over the. It doesn't have to be 5 years; it can be whatever you want. But to printed pieces that would show, again, with photos and text that could be used in community meetings or as educational pieces, available on your website too in electronic form. Photo and social media contests. This is one we did for the duck hunting opener, but getting people to be social and be talking about. I mean, one of the great things is the sign. Using that sign whenever get people to associate when they see that when they're out and about, to associate that with the fund. You have a you have a newsletter or an email list for people that subscribe. I think there's an opportunity to grow it and to use that. You have those email addresses from folks who receive like the updates on Fridays during session. But if you offer people new and interesting things or kind of more engaging content to grow that email list and give them more reason to pay attention. One of the things we think is an online newsletter would be a great idea, and again, pretty easy to put together. There's just an example of the State's Parks and Trails. They do one, but give people a quarterly update on, or a month. It doesn't have to be monthly. It can be just during session on what the council's up to, what the fund is up to, what's coming up next, spotlights on partners, that kind of stuff. Promote it through your social media and maybe encourage people to submit their own photos. You wouldn't have a hard time finding content and photos to fill it. And then sponsored social media. So the folks that see your posts now are fans or followers of you. If you can invest some money behind it where you expand your reach on social media to go to a bigger audience. But there's ways to do it. Here's an example of Pheasants Forever and Polaris. So profit and not-for-profit, where this partnership then expands the reach of their of Pheasants Forever's social media by capitalizing on some of Polaris's clout. There's opportunities for this that exist, at large and small, that we think could be explored with pretty cheap and pretty effective, because you have, again, so many like-minded businesses, so many fans already, that I think it would be, you'd find some willing partners. So yeah, that's our presentation. If there's anything I didn't cover, if there's anything that I can answer questions for, or please let me know.
Thank you, Mr. Thornton. And
Thank you.
members, any questions? Representative Becker-Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wondering if you can talk about how sophisticated your work is, particularly I'm thinking with Facebook, with sort of it isn't enough to just have a page and have followers, you have to be commenting on other things and tagging other things and, just wondering how sophisticated that work is as far as actually making it, helping us reach more people.
Yes, thank you for the question. So, right, we don't just sort of post it and leave it alone. We do monitor everything, both looking for positive and negative questions, and then tagging tagging sort of related partners or groups or organizations that are involved in a way that, exactly like you say, to sort of be social in social media. It's not just like a billboard or a corkboard where you leave it alone, right? So yes, we're always looking for opportunities to maximize, I guess, the engagements per post. Yep.
Any other questions, members? Yes, Kristen?
Mr. Chair, I don't know if this maybe is a question for Mark, but so the contract's through December. So what do we do then? Does staff pick up the work or?
Mr. Chair and members, Kristen, that's a good question, and that's one we're going to take up in December at the December meeting. It's been really interesting so far working with Russell Herder. Our options moving forward, of course, are we could try to pick it up as staff. As we mentioned before, that's something that's kind of beyond our expertise, so to speak, but also it just stretches the staff further. It will depend too who we bring in the commission assistant position, if that person has some talents in that area or not. But the opportunity for expanding the message or just continuing the message of what the Outdoor Heritage Fund is and where those dollars go is as broad as we want to make it. So far, it's been really good. It's been really interesting. We've had great feedback from the partners, from the public as well, seeing the posts, and it's been easy for staff to be able to work with Russell Herder to get that done. So having an outsider contractor, having someone dedicated to that is really, I think, important. But that, again, will be kind of that discussion we look at in December. We'll have some final updates for the council when we get to our December meeting, or maybe it'll actually be January. I'm not sure. I think it'll be December, though, and we'll go from there.
Any other questions, council? Yes. Ashley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question, and I apologize if I missed this, but how are you measuring overall impact? So did you do a survey to find out what percentage of Minnesotans know what the Outdoor Heritage Fund is, and then how to know what the overall benefit is of these public relations?
We have not done a survey about of Minnesotans about what they know of the Outdoor Heritage Fund. No. What we do is we have our own internal, software that tracks things about where you are, where you're showing up, and what people are saying about you. Since kind of we got involved going back, I don't know, February, but we did not do like a historical look backward. There on your website there is some scholarship or some research on that. Some of it's a little bit dated, but we use that kind of as a jumping off point, is like, okay, here's where people already know about the fund and the council. Here's maybe where there are some gaps that we can. So my strategy is it's easier to start with somebody that knows a little and dial them up to a little bit more than it is to start with somebody that knows absolutely nothing and try to bring them up to a moderate level of knowledge. So that was where we started first, with sort of the people that had a base knowledge of the fund. We've been able, since we've gotten going, through the generosity of a lot of the partners and stuff that have helped us and shared with it, we've been able to kind of go after those folks that maybe started out more of as a neophyte level or whatever. But we did not do a look back, though, before we started work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've just noticed that in informing friends and others that I'm on the Outdoor Heritage
Yeah.
Fund. There are a number of people who didn't know what it was until they had a personal connection
Yep.
to it. So just kind of stating for the record that I think that that's something to take into account for future conversation
Yep.
around public relations. Thank you.
Well, and you know, there's also folks that are in the same sphere, kind of doing the same work. So how do you distinguish? You know, I would get questions all the time. Is this the lottery fund? And no, it's not. Then you know you have to go back a step. So yeah, that's been a huge part of it.
Thank you. Any members, any other questions? Ms. Swenson?
Thank you. And I'm not sure if this maybe is a question for Mark, but there was a question about the next steps. There was also some recommendations that were provided. Are those recommendations going to be reviewed by the staff or by the council, or where do we go with those?
Mr. Chair, members, yes, staff is looking at those recommendations, and actually, I think they'll be finalized when we get to the end of the RFP. But there are some preliminary ones right now.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, yes, Mr. Johnson.
If I may interject one thing, it's because Member Peters had brought up the historic knowledge about what do people know, have we been reaching out to people? A couple times in the past, actually twice, maybe it's 3 times now, we have participated in survey with the University of Minnesota and where they send out information or surveys statewide and asking people what they know about different things. And one is the Outdoor Heritage Fund. Of all the different funds, the Outdoor Heritage Fund seemed to be the one that people were most, if I remember right, were a little bit more familiar with compared to arts and cultural heritage or clean water or whatever. I think clean water was right there with us, and then arts and cultural heritage was close behind. But what it taught us was, through those couple of times, it's expensive to be part of those, which is good and bad. But what it really taught us is that there's so much of the public who don't know anything about the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, much less to speak of the Outdoor Heritage Fund. So that was another incentive back for the council a number of years ago to start considering better communications and ultimately to this RFP.
Thank you. Council, I do have some questions as an old
Great.
newspaper guy.
Great.
A couple months ago, we sat here and decided on sending $119 million, spending that public's money. And I was astounded, unless I missed them, there wasn't any major newspaper reporters here. So I go, why is that? Well, did we send out just a news release? Because news releases don't work anymore. You need maybe a news release, and then for certain people, a phone call. I don't know if you've looked at that, but I still don't know why they weren't here. They should have been. So a squeaky wheel gets the grease, is true. So then I thought, why aren't we providing like some radio clips of what happened that day and offering them to radio stations? Even video clips for the TV stations. I work for KARE 11 a lot, and you know, I don't want to pick on them, but unless sometimes if I didn't tell them the deer season was opening, you wouldn't hear anything about it. Mm-hmm. So those are questions that come to my mind. And one more thing, Council, I think we talked about this before. Maybe we should move our meetings around the state a little bit. There's nothing magical about Room 5 here. We can get the same work done and get it done in Worthington, International Falls, Duluth, whatever, and that would help spread the word. And I don't know, Mark, if that doesn't take an act of Congress to do. We could do that. The other thing that's always puzzled me is that we have the Outdoor Heritage Fund, we have the Legacy Amendment, and we have the Lessard-Sams Council. You talk about confusing the public, because we use those names interchangeably, but they're really not. But I think all we do is tend to confuse people with those 3 names. Now, I don't have a solution for that, but and then our sign that we see in the projects, I think it's ridiculously busy. And I would like a sign that just said, "This is here thanks to the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota." Doesn't that get to the crux of it? So anyway, I'm just
Well-
curious about your reaction here.
So let me start at the beginning and move backwards. We had some ideas when you had your last meeting for some media attention around the approval of the projects. After going back and forth with staff a little bit, we decided we were going to wait until what's the date in where it becomes a final recommendation.
The December meeting where we have it actually approved.
Yeah. And then that's, I would invite folks to that. I would hope to get some media attention out of that. But yes, we do have something in the works for the big package of money. You also asked about the confusion among names and naming. It's real and it exists. I'm not going to lie to you. I've found Outdoor Heritage Fund works better than Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Fund. I've found talking about the fund is more effective, quite frankly, than talking about the council. The council is people. The fund is the outdoors. It's habitat. It's prairies. It's it's something that. So all of our social channels are the Outdoor Heritage Fund, not the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Council. The thinking for that was, one, it's the money that is funding these projects that makes Minnesota a great place to live, that is different than sort of the people behind it, the people come and go, et cetera. So yes, it is a confusing thing. I don't know what it would, how you would go about a rebrand. I feel like it's probably would need a few more people in this room to tackle that one. But for me, when I go out and talk to folks, I focus on the Outdoor Heritage Fund, and I figure if they know what that is, that's a good enough place to start, or that's better than nothing. That's kind of how my approach has been. The third thing, your sign. It's so yeah. So if you're out in nature and you see this sign, you're going to be a ways away before you see it, and it's 4 vertical columns. One of them is a jazz note, right? So yeah, you got to be right on top of it, I guess, to see it, and the 4 colors. When we first started doing design work, we were using the green until staff told us that no, we're the yellow or the orange. Or did I do that backwards? But anyway, so yeah, it took us a little while to figure that out. But the reason that I like the sign, I guess, is because it is a marker. It is there. It's something that people can snap a photo in front of. It's a little bit of something that gives you a place even to check into. But yeah, if you wanted to again put a map of the state of Minnesota on it, I think that could work too. I don't know if I did a very good job of answering your questions. I kind of agree with you on some of the points.
Thank you. Any other questions? And
Oh, and you mentioned video and TV clips.
radio clips.
Yeah, I mean now today's the first day of TV, right? That we have video. So yeah, and definitely, I think that's a great idea.
I think a TV clip would have to. I don't think you could take
No,
anything from this.
Right, but you can get. But part of the thing is to get.
You need some kind of reporter.
People
to
out in
assess
the
this.
people out in the. I mentioned that one of the recommendations is tours. Agree with you. Get people out and about. Where is it? Organize public tours and events with partners. Yeah, that's makes for very good television in particular.
All right. And no further questions? Oh, yes, one more. Mr. Saxon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I kind of agree with it seems to be somewhat of a consensus here that what we're calling our organization is kind of confusing. And, you know, whether we call it Lessard-Sams or we call it the Outdoor Heritage Fund or whatever, I think we ought to get down to one deal, you know, because they confuse people. So if I was just appointed 2 months ago and they say, congratulations, what is this now, you know, and what do you call it? And I think we should do that.
Thank you. there are no further questions, thank you. Yes, yes.
So I'm not sure what we're trying to accomplish here. I understand that we're trying to make people more aware of the fund by spending money on advertising. But it seems to me, if we're going to have the taxpayers pay for these funds or these projects, that we're wasting money on advertising, because the people who come in here and ask for the money are the same people all the time. And then they do a project. And yeah, it'd be beautiful to find out that we have an outdoor heritage fund that is funding these projects, that is doing some great work in whatever field you want to talk about. But I have no idea why we're doing this. I voted against it, just so you know, and I made the point that I don't think we're going to accomplish anything, because it's nice that we got some more web hits. That's going to keep going. Even if we change the name to one name, all those other things are still going to come up on the internet when you search it. And I don't know, are your friends now really happy that you're on the Outdoor Heritage Council, and that they're aware of it now, and that we're doing beautiful things? Well, and they're going to benefit from all the things that we do because of the projects that we do. But just having more people know about this, or be probably the only people it's going to benefit are people like me, who is an elected official that's going to take credit for it, because all the rest of you are just appointed. And and so me sitting here saying that I don't see any value in us advertising. It's nice that people know what's going on and where their taxpayers' dollars are being spent. And by the way, I think that's really a bad idea to say this is paid for by the taxpayers instead of having our logo there. I think our logo is a really big thing to put there. But I don't see any value to this at all, but that's just me, I guess.
Thank you, Senator. Just think, we get the word out, we'll get you reelected, see?
Well, I don't know if this will get me reelected or not, but mining and polymet might.
Mr. McNamara.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess the one comment I would make, I think the best publicity we got was your TV show. And the fact, I don't understand why we don't get more of the outdoor writers. We actually used to get them to come once in a while to these meetings. I think it was because we were more controversial then, and they came for the controversy. Because we're doing such great things and we're spending money on good projects, it's just a matter of which ones we spend it on. But I think any of us, if we get a chance to run into those outdoor writers, and once in a great while they contact us for a comment, I think if we can ask them to come to the meeting, I think that would be good. And if they can write about it, the more the people on the ground see the actual work we're doing. And I think we're making headway. Over the years, the sign has become more pronounced and is on the projects as we do more projects. I think people on the ground are beginning to see it, and the folks that really, the hunting and fishing and outdoor people. But sorry, but the best thing advocate we can probably have, as this is fine if we want to spend a little money. I think Senator Thomasoni makes a good point, but people like yourself and any of us spreading the word and trying to convince one of the outdoor writers to do a good article on the great things, I think is the best thing that can happen. We used to get more publicity. It seemed that maybe it was because we were controversial.
Thank you. Any more comments? Representative Becker-Finn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just wanted to highlight, I think, in this overall discussion, how important it is that we are being on video today. I mean, that is one of the benefits of being in this room, is that we do have the capability to do that. And I think, if we're asking people, it's one thing to ask a reporter to sit through a 4-hour meeting in case something interesting happens. It's another thing for someone else to say, oh, there was a really good discussion, you should go back and watch the video. Is a lot more helpful, I think, in that piece. And I think as well as the public expects to see video of things. I mean, that's something that we learn as legislators, is that they expect to be able to see video. If it's important, then it should be videotaped, so people know what's happening. And so I just wanted to highlight kind of how important it is that this is the first time we're being videotaped, and it's part of this discussion as well. If we want people to know what we're doing, asking them to listen to some audio is a little bit different than asking them to watch a 2-minute clip if there's something interesting that happens. So
Yes, Senator?
To that point, nothing really happens in regards to this committee until we actually pass it at the legislature. And at that point in time, that's when a report from the media could be written by I don't know, a Star Tribune writer or something, to look what they did in the outdoor heritage, and this just got passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. Because until that happens, there's really no news. And that might be part of the problem. But just to highlight something that Danny just said, that clip you did was spectacular. That video that you did.
Thank you.
I thought it was great. But I never saw it until you brought it here into the outdoor heritage and showed it to us. So I don't know where it played. But I think my point is that this is one of those kind of commissions of the legislature that is interesting to the people who are interested in it. And those are the people that know about it. And so, we live in our political bubble all the time and think that people are following us all the time and know exactly what we're doing. And then I walk downtown and somebody says to me, "Why aren't you in Washington today?" So it's not as if people really know what we do, and it's really hard to get the word out. I think that we're going to have a select number of followers, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be interested in this because there's some money out there for some projects, and they want to come in here and get it. And our job is to figure out which projects to give it to and what benefit there is to the outdoors. And I think I think we do a pretty good job of that, actually.
Well, thank you. Good points. Being an old communication guy, I still, I'll just say this, that program on Minnesota Bound aired several times on KARE 11 that covers all of Minnesota and into also Mankato, Rochester, and a couple other stations I can't think of. It also appeared on Fox Sports North several times. And so it did get out there. And, I happen to think people should know what's going on. And even though, of course, when the legislature and the governor make the final say, that is news, but it's also news when citizens get together and spend recommend spending $118 million. That's rather amazing if you put it in the context of what happens in some other states. So anyway, enough of that. Thank you. Any other questions? And again, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
And Danielle for being here. Thank you very much.
Have a great rest of your day.
All right, moving on. Our speaker for number 6 is not here yet, and so we're going to move to number 7. Judy Schulte from Minnesota DNR says she is ready to talk to us about an extension on the accelerated native prairie bank protection phase 6. Ms. Schulte, would you just identify yourself for the record, please?
Yes, I am Judy Schulte, prairie biologist for the Scientific and Natural Areas Program with the Minnesota DNR. And I am here to request an extension. And I printed the wrong form, but an extension for the ML17 Native Prairie Bank acquisition appropriation. We are asking for 1 additional year to work on our acquisition projects. We're just a little behind and could use a year to catch up. I can go into details on why we're behind if you would like. Thank you.
Members, I haven't had time myself to look at this. Any questions? Or Mr. Johnson, please?
Mr. Chair, before Ms. Schulte maybe provides a little more information on this or background, just to remind you that acquisition within an appropriation generally has a 2-year window for them to acquire the land. So this appropriation would be, and their availability for those acquisition dollars ends on June 30th of 19. It was a ML17 appropriation. Unless there's an extension of another year, and Sandy's shaking her head, so I'll let you chime in a little bit if I said something wrong. But within that 2 years, before the 2 years is done, if they get a purchase agreement, then of course you get another year extension. Sandy, did I state something wrong on the ML?
Acquisitions are 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah, so she's asking for an additional year on this
Right, yeah.
request.
Sorry. At any rate, thank you for correcting me on that. So what they're asking here for is just extending it one more year so they can get some other work done, or get some of the work done that they had planned. And Judy, I don't know, were there any extenuating circumstances, project that fell through, et cetera?
It's kind of a buildup. So we, in 2016, did a review of our payment rates, and we ended up lowering them, which is great. You get more acres for your dollar. But what happened then is all the money we had requested before we made that change, we now had, we could now almost double, like we almost doubled our acre goals for our ML14 and our ML15 appropriations. So we significantly exceeded acre outcomes for those appropriations, but what it did is it kind of used up our waiting list. And then, so we kind of pushed acquisitions we had planned for this appropriation onto those older appropriations, actually. And so it just kind of put us behind moving forward. And the lower payment rates, we are finding are harder to sell. So those are the challenges that come with it, is landowners take more time to think about it. They're waiting longer to make decisions. And so we're ultimately, I feel like we're getting you more for your dollar, but it is taking us more time, and it has set us behind. We started adjusting our requests as soon as those rates were changed. So starting in ML18, the appropriation is better suited for our cost per acre now, but the earlier appropriations were still, we asked for the money before we lowered our rates, so.
Any other questions, members?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd move to approve the extension.
We have a motion to approve the extension. Is there a second to that? I'm sorry?
We don't need one.
Don't need a second? Okay, thank you. Any more discussion? I'm just curious, are the odds of making more acquisitions out there, or are you at a dead end?
They're out there. I would, the best analogy I like to use is the low-hanging apples are gone. So we're now breaking out the ladder, and it's taking us longer to get to the good ones. So Prairie Bank, we have really high standards, and if we want to keep our standards, it's going to take us longer to do acquisitions than it used to.
Do you need to raise your rates, perhaps?
That would help. We have to consider, real estate market. Are we driving the market? And all of that comes into play. The question is, what is the true cost of native prairie, right? What is the true value of native prairie? Is it the same as all other recreational land, which is how in a real estate world it would appraise? Or is native prairie really more valuable to the state of Minnesota? And that's kind of the internal big question. So we match real estate world right now, but is that the true value of native prairie?
All right, we have a motion to extend this. Any more discussion, members? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can continue. Is Randy here yet?
He's snowbound, but Kelly Wilder will take his place.
Okay, is Ms. Wilder here? We're going back to number 6, members, in case you're wondering.
Good morning, Chair and members. My name is Kelly Wilder. I'm the DNR's liaison to the council. And Randy Prachar had a situation arise this morning, and he cannot actually make it down, so I'm going to do my best to speak to his extension request. If we run into questions that I can't answer, we'll determine whether we want to ask him to come back. So I'm here to speak to an extension request for the Roseau Lake Rehabilitation Project. This is a really great project in our mind that brings significant wildlife habitat and flood damage reduction benefits, and we're here to request an extension for all project funds to June 30th of 2022. We have spent most of the professional services funds to date, but it's a very complex project, and we've run into delays with the acquisition dollars, and so have not spent those nor the restoration and enhancement dollars. And so we have some willing sellers that we're in discussions with, and the partnership with the watershed is going well, so we're confident that we can move forward with the project, but just need a little bit more time.
I don't know, it's beeping over here, but
Dan is coming in and out evidently.
members, any questions about this? Yes, Mr. McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, is either staff going to talk about the letter that was just put in our packet? We didn't see it before, that references this project, or do they know if somebody's in the audience that wants to speak to the letter because it specifically addresses this issue?
Hello. Hey, Mark.
Hello, you're here.
Hello, this is Randy Prachar.
Oh, we have Randy Prachar on the phone. So,
You got Dan back on the phone too, here, and communicating with Randy. I didn't know what was going on, so.
Well, we have Kelly, we have Kelly Wilder here also speaking on Randy's behalf.
Just so you guys know too, there's a 40-second delay or whatever between real time and what the video feed is, so it's hard for me to participate because of that delay, but anyway, here we go.
We had a question about the letter that was sent from Mr. Schnitger, the legal counsel for some landowner, a landowner up there. Have you seen this letter again?
Not the one
Not the
today.
latest one? I don't know if anybody can talk to it, but.
Either. This is Randy Prachar.
Mr. Chair and members, that letter just came in yesterday afternoon from Mr. Schnitger, and that's why it's in the packets now. I mentioned that during my report this morning, and that and I mentioned that that it was with regards to this request, and also that at the end of the letter, actually the end of the email, I think it's one of the last paragraphs, it states they're requesting that the request for extension be denied. That Mr. Schnitger, on behalf of the landowner, is requesting that. That's the extent I know of that. As far as the rest of the letter, as I read it yesterday and as I remember at this point, it really refers to more the Red River Watershed District. Roseau River Watershed District. That's it, yes, thank you. And the communications of Mr. Schnitger and his client with them, and is not with regards to DNR necessarily or this project, but it's some other concerns they have with data practices and data access through the watershed district.
Yes, Mr. McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Executive Director Johnson, for that update. I'm wondering, Mr. Chair, if Mr. Prachar or Ms. Wilder, if we shouldn't give them an opportunity to see the letter. I understand it's an interested party represent one of the landowners on the project. And then, Representative Fabian, have you been able to see the letter?
Yes, I have. Yep, I have it in front of me here.
Okay, thank
The one
you.
that's addressed to Executive Director Johnson, the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Council, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, and then there's also an attachment in that email from Mr. North to Mr. Schnitger.
And Mr. Chair, we have the attachment, Representative Fabian, here, but I'm wondering, I understand it's DNR's proposal, but do we want the DNR folks to, I'm wondering, Mr. Chair, if we give them an opportunity to read this, maybe we do a different thing or take our break now. But I'm thinking both of them, if we're going to talk about this letter, it would be better if they've seen it. Do we have the ability to send it electronically to Mr. Prachar? Is it scanned in or something?
Yes, we could forward it to him. Mr. Chair and Member McNamara, yes, we could forward it to him. I have it on email.
Is this also something we can postpone to December? so everybody has a chance to look at all this. There seems to be a squabble here that we're in the middle of.
Ms. Wilder is shaking her head yes.
Yeah, Chair and members, we would be fine with delaying this until December. You heard from Mr. An attorney for the Kaveen family at the last meeting, as well as Randy was down here. And so, as Mr. Johnson described, we do not believe that these concerns are relevant to the project and extension that we're requesting, but if it would be preferable to the council, we can certainly delay until December.
I would support that.
Thank you. Council, any thoughts there? Yes, Ms. Swenson?
Just make a motion to table item 7 for December meeting.
We have a motion to table 7. Mr. McNamara?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I did read the letter while we had some time during the previous presentation, and I'm wondering, I did Google, I think they only have 3 staff members on that watershed district, it looks like, and it's a pretty extensive data, public data request from the lawyer and from the engineer. I'm just wondering, is there somebody at DNR or with Lessard-Sams that can reach out to the watershed district? I don't know that we want to reach out to the lawyer or the engineer, and make sure they understand how to answer their questions. I'm trying to be relatively nice here, but this letter from the engineer is really nitpicking I'm baffled at this. This is a landowner that lives in Roseau that could, I'm sorry, Representative Fabian, I understand it was one of the worst sugar beet harvests ever, and these guys are probably pretty bummed out, but it's over now. It's 16 degrees and you got 5 inches of snow. Can't they jump in their pickup and drive down and visit with these 3 people and figure out what's going on, as opposed to getting some lawyer in the cities and an engineer in Wisconsin? And I know it's Representative Fabian's district, but back to my point, I'm wondering if either DNR or somebody in our staff can reach out to the watershed district if they need help in understanding the data practice, or does the watershed district have the overriding organization that they can reach out to so they don't get themselves in trouble? So maybe before our December meeting, at least we know the landowner understands what's going on. Because some of these basic questions I could answer. They keep worrying about their land getting bought. They can't buy the land. They can't use eminent domain to buy the land for the practices. We told that lawyer over here when he was here last month. I would hope that he could tell his property owners that, as opposed to, sorry. But I'm wondering if we can reach out and help them with the data practice with that. And then again, reiterate for the landowner, sorry, I'm on.
Mr. Johnson?
Mr. Chair and members, just so you all know, to reiterate a little bit from the last meeting, actually, Mr. Schnicker brought it up at the last meeting when he testified. Mr. Schnicker had asked us for information on data practices, and we got all of that to him. Actually, Sandy had it to him, I think, within an hour of his request. So all of the background information for the Roseau River Rehabilitation Project and appropriation, as well as all of the information on the proposal for the Roseau River Watershed District, are in their hands already. So this other information is strictly information from the Watershed District on their communications, et cetera. All of our information is to them. We can certainly reach out to them and see if there's anything more that the Watershed District needs from us, but I believe all of the information necessary from us has been provided. And one last point of information, I believe the Kaveen family that's being represented here is actually an out-of-state resident from Wisconsin, I believe, or another state, not from Minnesota.
We have a motion on, Mr. Fabian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Denny hit the nail on the head there. This is obviously a huge project. It's a big project. And the Roseau River Watershed District, he's right, is minimally staffed. And I would support, tabling this until December. I'm sure that Mr. Prachar, who's on the line, and others, we had quite a snow event up here yesterday, so it was difficult to travel. It's the first time in 9 years that I've turned around and headed back home because of road conditions. So it was pretty treacherous. But to the point that Denny makes, yeah, this was a catastrophic year in the ag community up here. Much of the land that we're talking about, and Randy can address it even better than I can, the soybeans that are up in that whole area are under 2 or 3 feet of water as we speak. So they're never going to be harvested. 80% of the potato crop is in the ground. 50% of the sugar beet crop is in the ground. And and I realize that that's a different topic, but the point is that the watershed people have been, pardon the pun, they've been swamped with stuff this fall. So I think it's probably in the best interest to table it.
Thank you, Representative Fabian. Any more discussion? And we'll take a vote to table this item 6 until next meeting in December. If there no further discussion, all in favor, aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Passed. And thank you, Ms. Wilder, for
Thank you.
being here. And we will take up this sticky issue next month. All right. Moving on to item 8. And we're doing really well here on the time. Is it Hubinger? Hubinger, thank you. Item number 8, and Greg Hubinger, Director of the Legislative Coordinating Commission. And just for the record, Mr. Hubinger, would you give us your name again? Maybe pronounce it better than I am.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Greg Hubinger with the Legislative Coordinating Commission. For some of you, the Legislative Coordinating Commission is a 12-member body made up of 6 members of the House and 6 members of the Senate, and includes the leadership from both bodies. That commission provides oversight for all of the legislative commissions and joint agencies. Our office provides administrative and policy support to the work of the House and Senate, and we have some role in coordinating the legislature's responsibilities with regard to the accessibility standards. So thanks for inviting me to talk about and provide some basic information about the accessibility standards. I thought I'd start by defining some terms and providing some background. When websites and digital documents are properly designed and coded, people with disabilities can use them. However, currently many sites and some of those documents are developed with accessibility barriers that make them difficult or impossible for some people to use. An accessible document or website is one that meets the state of Minnesota's accessibility standards. Those standards were adopted by Minute, a state agency, in 2010, and incorporate standards that were developed under federal law. These standards provide the technical specifications and guidelines for making digital content accessible. Executive branch state agencies are required by law to comply with those standards. The other 2 branches of state government are working on their own to comply. Under legislation passed in the 2019 session, the legislature will be required to comply with those standards by 2024. Much of the legislature's website, which consists of web pages and PDF documents, is in compliance with the state's accessibility standards. So bills and session laws and statutes and rules are accessible and meet the state standards. Many of the documents that legislative offices post to our websites are PDFs, portable document format documents, which is a file format that's used to present and exchange documents reliably, independent of software and hardware or operating systems. Creating PDFs that comply with the accessibility standards is not an automated process. Staff in our legislative offices remediate PDFs by adding tags or codes so that a screen reader will read a document in a way that makes sense to the user. Some documents can be easy to remediate, while other documents that contain tables or charts or graphs can be much more difficult and take several hours to fix. Documents that we create internally and post to legislative websites are generally tagged or coded to be in compliance with the state standards. However, because of the nature of legislative work, which is complex and fluid and fast-paced, these tagged PDFs may not be immediately available. An additional accessibility challenge for the legislature is that many of the documents that are submitted for posting come from public citizens or non-legislative entities or even state agencies and are not accessible. Legislative web pages also include audio and video files for the first time for this commission, and they're posted on our committee pages. Streaming video that is either broadcast or webcast is captioned in order to make it accessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. In addition, the House and the Senate and the LCC are exploring ways to make transcripts of audio recordings available as well. It might be helpful to make a point about the difference between an accommodation and accessibility. Some citizens have testified that various documents on legislative web pages are not accessible. While sometimes that's an accurate statement, at other times, many of those documents really are accessible in that they meet the state's accessibility standards. In some cases, while a document is accessible, it may not meet the needs of an individual user, and instead, a reasonable accommodation may have to be made in order to make that document accessible to that person. So accessibility and accommodation are different. Accessibility focuses on everyone. An example of that is a curb cut on a sidewalk. That makes it accessible for someone in a wheelchair, but makes it easier for others of us who might trip on that curb. So that curb cut is making it accessible. An accommodation, on the other hand, focuses on individual needs and requires separate fixes to meet that specific person's needs. The legislature and the state of Minnesota generally are working on how to meet those individual needs and are looking at how to create policies to handle those accommodation requests. In sum, as an institution, the legislature is committed to making its services and proceedings available and accessible to all Minnesotans. Legislative offices are working every day to try to make its documents and digital content available to meet the needs of all. Accessibility is frequently discussed in our IT working groups and in other staff groups that are organized around the legislature. Legislative staff from the reference library and from our GIS offices are members of statewide government working groups focusing on particular issue areas that affect all state agencies and the legislature. In addition, relevant staff from the legislative commissions meet regularly to discuss issues and possible solutions that they are working on to deal with documents that they are posting to legislative websites. And finally, as provided in the 2019 legislation, a formal working group consisting of staff from across legislative offices will be established to coordinate its efforts to comply with the standards by 2024. Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Council, any questions about how the communication works in the state of Minnesota? Okay, if they're not being, we're done there. Mr. Hubinger, thank you for joining us and for your information. Appreciate it. All right. Yeah, I think, well, I'll ask the council, do you want to take a little break now, or do you want to charge ahead for maybe one more? What's yeah mean? Keep going? All right. If the mineral rights folks are here, I don't know if they are. We're a little ahead of schedule.
She is, but Greg Hoch is here for the next one in our Prairie.
Oh, yeah, Greg is here. Are you prepared, Greg, to jump in here? We'll go to number 10 and then we'll take a break. How's that? So we're at number 10 here, the Minnesota Prairie Recovery Plan and Overview and Update. Looking forward to this one.
Steve Chapin, the Nature Conservancy, is joining you.
Okay, Greg, introduce yourself and whoever's joining you there, if you'd be so kind.
Good morning. Thank you for this invitation to speak to you this morning. My name is Greg Hoch, the Prairie Habitat Supervisor with the DNR. My co-presenter is Steve Chaplin with the Nature Conservancy. I'm going to begin by giving some basic background on grassland ecology, some of the methods we used for restoration and management. Steve will then go into some of the specifics about the rewrite or the second edition of the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. Before I start, I just want to talk about some of the resources we have in this state. We have RIM, we have the Environmental Natural Resources Trust Fund, we have the Outdoor Heritage Fund. No other states have these. When I talk to folks in other states, they just kind of fall over backwards when I tell them about the opportunities that we have here. However, I would like to argue that we have an even more valuable resource, and that's the people and the partnerships. I'm speaking specifically today about the Prairie, but I think these extend to some of the other parts of the state also. Again, I have lots of other colleagues in other states and talking to them. In some states, the feds don't get along with the state very well. All the NGOs are constantly squabbling and bickering among themselves. In Minnesota, we work really, really well together. I can't quantify that. I can't put a number on it. I can't put a dollar sign on it, but it's incredibly invaluable the way we're able to get stuff done because we do communicate. In the last couple of years, before I've started my OHF proposal, I thank Sandy for putting Neil Feakin in front of me, and I thank Neil for covering everything that I wanted to cover in my presentation. I wasn't joking when I said that. What this tells me, though, is that everyone involved in prairie conservation in Minnesota is on the same page. We're all speaking with the same talking points. That's because we work well together and we communicate constantly with each other. Some of those communications are formal meetings. Others are just phone calls and emails. But we all know what each other's doing, and we all coordinate and cooperate really well. The last thing I want to say is I want to reassure council members that we don't take these funds for granted. It would be pretty easy to kick back and say, we've got Outdoor Heritage Fund, we're good to go. The partners that we work with pursue funding opportunities at every chance we get. North American Waterfowl Conservation Act, NAWCA, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWIF, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grants. In fact, OHF dollars are providing a lot of state dollars that provide a non-federal match for these grants, which is often limiting in other states. So just wanted to say that even though we have these funds, we're not sitting back, we're not being lazy, we are being as aggressive as possible in pursuing as many other funds as we can. So partners, this is a partial list. These are some of the Minnesota Prairie Plan partners, although there are many others. And I just want to start off with giving you a couple of examples of ways we've been able to use specifically some of these funds. These are 3 individuals from the Detroit Lakes area representing the DNR, the Nature Conservancy, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. What they've been able to do in recent years is when they're doing a restoration on a WMA or a WPA, they start out about a year and a half in advance, figuring out we have wet soils, dry soils, etc. What seed and how much seed do we need for each of those soil types? We know that burning produces lots of flowers and lots of seed. So what they will do is they will coordinate between DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Nature Conservancy lands to try to prioritize burning on those acres because they know they need to harvest seed from that soil type to do this restoration. And they will work together, they will coordinate, they will share seed, et cetera, et cetera. Again, just want this, there are several of these efforts out there. This is just the one I'm the most familiar with. Another one, just looking at the landscape. So this is the WMA, WPA complex just to the southwest of Hutchinson. What you see there is a WMA, it's Raslin WMA there in the middle in the orange. And then we have Eagle Lake WPA over on the west side and Barber Lake WPA over on the northeast side. And then there, just to the north, kind of outlined in yellow, is a walk-in access property. So just to show you how well we play together on the landscape, so the most recent acquisition to the Raslin WMA, it was actually a PF acquisition using outdoor heritage funds that was then given to the DNR. The Fish and Wildlife Service did a lot of the wetland restoration because that's obviously what they specialize in. Over on the west side, the Fish and Wildlife Service bought a new 60-acre parcel. Right before they parceled it, the landowner had put 6.9 miles of tile into that 60 acres. Bowser hydrologists came in and were able to figure out you don't need to tear out all that tile, which would have obviously cost quite a bit. If you put 11 tile breaks in that, you can completely restore the hydrology on all 60 acres. That was pretty simple and relatively cheap. Then up here on the north, we have a walk-in access property that's actually on a RIM WRP easement. So we've got Bowser and NRCS working together to develop the easement. Then we have the National Resources Conservation Service going through the Minnesota DNR with our walk-in access program to put the walk-in access on that parcel. And then part of walk-in access is habitat enhancement, which we contracted with Pheasants Forever. And Pheasants Forever did some prescribed burning and some seeding on this property. So again, you can just see the number of different logos, and this is just one 2,000-acre area there, like I said, just southwest of Hutchinson, out in the western part of the state. One example, there are examples like this all over. Okay, remaining prairies and grassland. As probably you're all familiar with, we have about 1 to 1.4% of our prairies remaining. That's what Judy's Native Prairie Bank easement program is really focused on. We do have conservation programs. We've had soil bank in the past. We currently have CRP. Those are temporary. What I've got there is also a graph of our CRP acres in the state from 1985 to now. We had the soil bank program. Some of the older pheasant hunters in the room know the soil bank as the good old days. The peak of CRP were the good old days for pheasant hunting, but these programs come and go, unfortunately. Just to give you another idea of what things are like out there on the prairie, the 2019 State of the Birds, which is an Audubon program, also with the Cornell Ornithology Lab, using 1970 as a baseline, which to me is a pretty poor baseline, but that's as early as the data go. Forest birds are down 22% nationwide, shorebirds are down 37%, and grassland birds are down 53%. So that's what grassland birds have looked like here in recent times. We only have about 1.4% left. A colleague of mine, Dustin Graham, has been doing some research with the Minnesota Biological Survey. We're still losing about 200 acres of native prairie a year. That's to agriculture, that's to development, housing, and also to aggregate mining. This is a piece here, just a hillside, just absolutely covered with cotton candy pink with prairie smoke. And then here it is a year later, plowed up. This is pure sand. This would be terrible agricultural soil. But this is still happening out on the landscape. This is in the southeast corner of Norman County, up in the Beech Ridge area. Okay, a little bit of discussion on grassland restoration. Obviously, just protecting grassland isn't enough. We actually need to restore grassland to get our wildlife populations where we want them to be. Just a little bit of history of kind of how things have changed over the years. Back in the day, we planted brome and sweet clover and called it good. Today, we refer to these species as invasive. Starting mid-'80s or so and some of the early CRP, we used native grasses. We had no idea where the seed was coming from. I can take you to a number of places in Minnesota and say, yeah, that's big blue stem, but that ain't the local stuff. A lot of the seed we got was from Oklahoma, Nebraska, et cetera, et cetera. You plant that dry adapted seed into these moist, humid climates, and the grass goes nuts. Then we started adding a few forbs in more recent years, probably the last 10 years or so. A lot of our seed mixes, 40, 60, 80 species in those seed mixes. And we're now talking also about local ecotype seed, so finding seed that's genetically adapted to those local soils and climates. Okay, there's a bit of a philosophical debate there in what are we restoring. Going back to the old model, the low species diversity, let's just plant some dense nesting cover. Pheasants and mallards will be happy. If we throw a few forbs in there, be a little extra food for the pheasants. Good enough. What we've been focused on more in recent years is what I'll call an ecosystem model. Newer, it is a little harder, it is a little bit more expensive. Trying to recreate more of the diversity and the functions of the native prairie, and Steve's going to talk a little bit about function when he gets up here. And by the way, this is going to make some darn good pheasant habitat also. So here's a couple of photos I took. This is the Friday before pheasant opener this year. This happens to be a WPA down in Blue Earth County. It's a really nice one. It's a large WPA that's been purchased and restored over the years. So you can kind of see a chrono sequence of the methodologies we've done. So here's my able field assistant taking a photo of him at about 15 feet, maybe a little less. You can sort of, he's kind of there under the arrow on the left there. If you squint, you can kind of see him. This is the classic dense nesting cover model. Just get it as tall, as thick as possible. I remember taking this photo, I kind of looked down at my feet. I think I saw about 2 or 3 different species of grasses and forbs. Same site, a different area, newer restoration from a few years ago. Nice open landscape, very diverse. Again, look down at my feet. I think I remember counting about 14 or 15 species just in the couple square feet around my feet. I think I had, I'd done a survey of this site earlier. I think I had about 40 or 50 species overall at this larger site. Diverse, more open, still going to provide darn good pheasant habitat, but also provide probably some better habitat for some of our non-game songbirds. Okay, how we restore. I mentioned in one of those first slides, the partners, DNR, Fish and Wildlife, and TNC getting together for seed harvest. This is a seed harvest shed up at the Detroit Lakes Fish and Wildlife Service office. They've got about 40,000 pounds of seed laid out there that they're bagging up on this day. Common method is to go out in the spring, usually March. We call this snow seeding. You got a Vicon spreader on the back of the tractors, and you basically just spread the seed over the top of the snow. Nice this way, you can see exactly your seed density if you missed any spots. The snow melts, deposits the seed on that moist soil. You get some freeze thaw in the mornings and evenings, pulls the seed down into the soil, and you're good to go. Seed harvest. Do seed harvest several different ways. In some cases, we hire local contractors to harvest DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, or TNC lands. These are quite often native prairies or really well-established restorations. In some cases, we're purchasing seed from seed vendors. You've heard me talk before about the benefits to small businesses to some of this work. And in some cases, we'll actually have agency staff go out and harvest the seed for us. In other cases, we'll get the community involved. So here are some school children in the far left helping us harvest some early spring seeds, or species that bloom in the early spring. These are what we're traditionally missing. And then here we have a March snow seeding with a group of students up at Faith WMA up at Monoman County. You want to talk about getting the next generation hooked on conservation, getting kids excited about public lands and getting involved in public lands. This is the way to do it. This is some of the research I did in my previous job as a biologist for the DNR. Surveyed a number of native prairies and restored prairies. Again, we're doing really good. Our native prairies are always more diverse, but we're getting pretty good with our restorations. And so what I did is I looked at some of the phenologies of the plants, so plants that bloom at different times of the year. And we're doing really good on the mid and late summer, the asters, the blazing stars, the sunflowers, because they're really easy to harvest. What we're still kind of working on is the spring species, the blue-eyed grass, the pasque flowers, the prairie smokes. They're hard to harvest and they're hard to find from vendors. So we're doing good, but we still have obviously some places to go. One of the areas we're most concerned about this is with pollinators. We've got pollinators that need pollen and nectar throughout the growing season, as well as we need lots of insects out there early in the summer, or late in the spring, early in the summer, because that's when hens and growing chicks need that high protein source. Okay, enhancements. So fire is one of our primary enhancements. It removes thatch, knocks back woody veg, recycles nutrients, stimulates plant growth. However, it perhaps has mixed effects on insects as far as food. The other one we do talk about is conservation grazing, and again, Steve is going to talk about both of these here when he gets up. Grazing increases plant diversity. It also increases insect diversity, again, food resources for hens and chicks. Structural diversity. Ungrazed, the taller, thicker stuff provides great nesting habitat. The lightly grazed stuff, good place for chicks to run around in and brood. And more heavily grazed areas, as long as they're not heavily grazed every year, make nice display areas or sunny areas for chicks to warm up in the summer. Cattail control is also, we've been playing on both DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service properties using cattle in addition to some of the spraying methods that Ricky Leanne has talked about to this council before. There's a range of wildlife species. I know after the last meeting, I talked to Mr. Scherer about meadowlarks. they prefer really, really short vegetation, hence low sparrows like it as thick and dense as possible. So if we can have this range of structure out there, we can meet the needs of every species as well as meet the varying needs of individual species. So a prairie chicken needs short grass in the spring to leck on. It needs taller grass in the early summer to nest in, short grass to brood in, and then taller grasses again in the winter to roost in. There's a lot of data out there that shows blue-winged teal actually like to nest in grazed areas. Okay, restoration and enhancement, it isn't always pretty and it isn't always easy. In fact, it can really look kind of ugly there at some point in time. So here's a couple of pictures of some tree removal projects, and the one in the middle is we are plowing up some brome to get it restored to a diverse native stand of grasses and forbs. Okay, so while the process isn't pretty, we hope the final product is. One area I'd like to mention just briefly here is the benefits of grassland specifically beyond wildlife. And there's a lot of data out there in the scientific literature. It hasn't been translated as well as it could have been into just more understandable. Actually, a lot of the research is coming from Minnesota. So grasslands and wetlands store large volumes of rainwater and snowmelt. They mitigate downstream flooding. Grasslands and wetlands remove nitrates from water. That makes water safer. Nitrates blue baby syndrome is a current, or unfortunately, an issue across much of the Midwest. Grasslands and wetlands remove large amounts of carbon from the air, helping with our climate change issues. Grasslands reduce erosion, keep lakes and rivers cleaner, and grasslands and wetlands recharge groundwater supplies. Think about some of the things you've heard Scott Rawl talk about with the Worthington Wells project. Okay, benefits beyond science. Again, we have the science and data to demonstrate these ideas. A lot of the research comes from Minnesota. And just what we want to make the point is we tend to focus on, I myself, think about pheasants, waterfowl, et cetera, but a lot of the work we're doing for pheasants and waterfowl have much greater societal benefits keeping especially around our waters, keeping those waters cleaner and safer. And with that, I'm going to kick it off to Steve to talk some about the specifics of the Prairie Conservation Plan.
Well, thank you, Greg. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the council. My name is Steve Chaplin. I'm a senior conservation scientist with the Nature Conservancy. I'm also the lead author on the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. Now, the Prairie Conservation Plan was in direct response to the passage of Minnesota's Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. That was passed in 2008. It took us about a year to write the plan because we recognized a need for various conservation groups to be able to coordinate our efforts to conserve prairie in Minnesota. We also had, when we wrote that first plan, we had a goal of updating and revising it every 5 years. And so in 2006, we started the revision process. And so the cover that you see up on that slide is the second edition version of it that we have out there. But I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, between the first and second edition, our approach is unchanged. We still use the same approach of core areas, corridors, and agricultural matrix to sort of plan what we are trying to accomplish in prairie conservation. And the other thing that I think is really important to point out is that the major goals of the two editions are exactly the same, and they are twofold. We want the first goal, an overriding goal of the Prairie Plan is to protect all the remaining native prairie out there. So there's about 248,000 acres of native prairie in the state of Minnesota. And what I mean by native prairie, these are areas that are unplowed but still retain most of the appropriate native plant species. So that we know that there was about 121,000 acres of protected native prairie in 2010, right after the Conservation Amendment was passed. In 2016, about 6 years later, there was 129,000 acres. So we've actually increased the amount of protected native prairie about 8,000 acres over that 6-year period, and virtually all of that land was due to the funds from the Outdoor Heritage Council. So it's, that is one good measure of the sort of the results that we're having. Now, the other major goal that we want to accomplish in the Prairie Plan is that we want to create and maintain functioning prairie landscapes. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, we need to have places in Minnesota that are large enough and connected enough to maintain viable populations of almost all of Minnesota's native prairie animals and plants. We need to have places in Minnesota where those plants and animals can continue to exist on into the future. We also need to have those places as part of this functioning systems that retain ecosystem function, and that's the water, fire, pollinators, and stuff that Greg mentioned. So now I want to get a little bit specific here to talk about some of the things that we hope to accomplish through the Prairie Plan. So the first thing on the slide here, I want to talk a little bit about the prairie core areas. These are these functioning landscapes, the places in Minnesota that we want to be able to protect all of Minnesota's remaining prairie plants and animals. There's 28 of these core areas, about 2 million acres worth. We've made quite a few changes between the first and second changes as we learned more about these areas over that 6-year period. But the thing that I should note is that these 28 core areas, these 2 million acres, capture 77% of all the native prairie in Minnesota. So it does, for those of you who sort of remember back to your conservation biology class, if you had one, that's an amazing figure, that in that small an area over an entire state, we can capture 77% of all the native prairie in the state. Now, our goal in these prairie core areas is that we want to have 40% grassland, 20% wetland, and then the other 40% for other uses, mostly agricultural uses out there. So these core areas are not areas that we're thinking are going to be preserves. These are areas of functioning landscapes, areas where people work and live within and use native prairies as part of the mix of the local economy. And what we want to have come from these core areas are these functioning prairie systems. Now, moving on, besides the prairie core areas, we want to be able to tie those prairie core areas together. We want to have corridors that will get each of these core areas together. This is important because you need, even in areas as large as these prairie core areas are, you're not going to be able to maintain all plants and animals indefinitely. You're going to need to be able to have movements for recolonization or plants and animals to move back and forth along those areas out there. And so that what we created was a system where we have, in the blue on this map, corridors that now connect all of the prairie core areas, and including the prairie core areas down into Iowa, so that we're having a larger system that in response to a changing climate, these plants and animals have an opportunity to be able to move. Now, we're also thinking about, we also designed a set of what we call strategic habitat complexes. Those are the dark blue dots, the sort of stepping stones of habitat where we can ensure that, in fact, plants and animals don't have to go the full distance between core areas, but have sort of stepping stones along the way. We also added, as part of these strategic habitat complexes, 4 large wetland complexes that are the iconic duck hunting areas of Minnesota: Swan Lake, Heron Lake, Talcott Lake, and Agassiz National Wildlife Research. So that within these strategic habitat complexes, we want to have the same mix of habitat, 40% grassland, 20% wetland, that we had for the prairie core areas. But in the rest of the habitat corridors, our goal is to have about 10% of each of these in perennial vegetation that, that is not in cropland, so that there are at least a little bit of habitat, even in the places where you don't have the stepping stones. And our desired outcome for these corridors and strategic habitat complexes is that we want to have dispersal of prairie species along these corridors, ensuring the viabilities of the populations in the core areas. Okay, I want to say a little bit also about everything else, and that's the agricultural matrix. The prairie soils are what drives Minnesota's agriculture. It's those soils, those very, very deep carbon-rich soils that have allowed us to become, part of the breadbasket of the world. But it's also places where you can accomplish some conservation goals. We're not giving up on the rest out there besides cores and corridors, but out in the agricultural matrix, we would also like it to be a little bit more wildlife-friendly habitat. This is about 21 million acres. That's the agricultural part of Minnesota. consists of 53 major watersheds. And what we call for in the Prairie Plan is that at least 10% of each major watershed should be in grassland or wetland, and about 5% of that should be in protected grassland or wetland. We say only 5% because we recognize the contribution that the private grazing lands have out there in this agricultural landscape. There is a lot of private grazing lands out there that really are not going to be impacted very much other than through grazing, and so that we can recognize that the conservation value of those lands, and we've reduced the amount that we think needs to be in conservation ownership. And what we want to have as a desired outcome for the rest of this agricultural matrix is a more sustained agricultural landscape with enhanced wildlife populations, a healthy grazing economy, improved water quality, and more water retention. Now, just a couple of comments about conservation in agricultural context. We want to maintain a robust grazing economy that utilizes both private and public lands. This is what will drive conservation and the maintenance of grasslands, wetlands, and prairies in most of Minnesota, is being able to graze those lands profitably and be able to, but in a way that maintains the ecological functions. So one of the quotes from the Prairie Plan is, a well-managed private working lands let me start again. Well-managed private working lands contribute to the viability of grassland and wetland systems and provide private income generated from grasslands, which can be the single largest driving force for grassland conservation. The key question in all of this is, under what conditions can grass-based economic uses provide a superior return on labor and investment to sustain rural families and communities? That's what we have to figure out. We have to figure out how you can make grazing profitable enough so that you can maintain a viable local economy. Now, one of the new things to the second edition of the Prairie Conservation Plan is that we added an aquatic component to it. The first edition of the plan did not include, very much in aquatics at all. It was really concentrated on the grass and the wetlands out there. But what we're trying to accomplish now, in the core areas at least, is to identify, protect, restore, and manage the best examples of each of the major different kinds of aquatic habitats. And they're listed on this sheet. They go all the way from headwater streams to fens to large deep lakes, but these are the different types of habitat types that we're trying to be able to identify the best examples of and be able to make sure that at least some of those examples are protected within each of the core areas. We have a little bit different idea for what we think we ought to do about aquatic protection in the corridors and strategic habitat complexes in the agricultural matrix, is that we want to undertake local projects to create grassland wetland complexes, to increase stream buffers, to expand perennial cover, and undertake more wetland restoration. So this is to point out, in fact, we are now realizing that we should have realized, but it was probably too daunting in the first edition of the plan to include the aquatic portions of the environment as well as the terrestrial portions of the environment. And finally, I'd like to wind up here talking a little bit about prairie conservation in a changing climate. This was not a very big issue, frankly, when we first started talking about this prairie plan in the first edition. In the second edition, we recognized how important that issue was, but even since that time, it's becoming more and more an issue. Prairie conservation and dealing with climate change are, in fact, going to go hand in hand from now and into the futures. And there's two aspects, I think, of how prairie conservation is going to have to deal with climate change. The first is carbon capture. One of the things that I think people don't realize is that in a prairie environment, 80% of the prairie plant biomass is below ground. Almost all, that's to say, a big amount of all of the plants out there are below the surface of the ground. Furthermore, in these prairie habitats, roots, as shown in the figure on the left, frequently go down as far as 10 feet into the soil, deep into the soil. But you ask, why is that important? Why is it important that we have roots that are deep in the soil? Well, clearly it's because the plants, can survive better. But more importantly, as you go down in the soil profile, there's less and less oxygen there. And that's important because decomposition and decomposing bacteria need oxygen to be able to survive and decompose. So that roots that go down deep into the soil last. They're not going to be decomposed. Even after they die, they're going to be able to stay there for a long period of time. So the deeper you can get roots, the deeper you can get carbon into the soil, the more likelihood that they're going to stay there that carbon's going to stay there for a long period of time, and you're going to be able to store or sequester that carbon. And so that prairie, because far more than forests, far more than other habitats in Minnesota, have those deeper roots, it means that those prairies can sequester a great amount of carbon, capture carbon, and keep it there. And that will be one of the things that, prairie conservation is going to become more and more focused around. Now, the other thing that I want to say about changing climate and prairie conservation is that prairie conservation is often some of the most resilient sites. Now, I probably should have given you a big copy of the map on the right, but if you can see the map on the right, this is a map that shows the resilient areas in Minnesota, the places that are most resilient to climate change. And so that what that really means is that these are places that have natural vegetation and high diversity of environmental conditions, including a lot of wetter, moister habitats. Those are the sort of habitats that plants particularly are going to be drawn to in a hotter and drier climate. So that what we're looking at here is the dark green areas are the areas that are projected to be the areas that have the greatest resilience to climate change. You can see the prairie core areas in the sort of black outline there. And especially when you look in the western and southern half of the site, just about every green area there, highly resilient area, is within a prairie core area. Now, there are a lot of resilient areas in the, the forested part of Minnesota and the eastern part of Minnesota. But, we know one thing at this point about how prairie species are going to react to climate change. The one thing for sure that we know is that each species are going to react differently to climate change. But the ones that are going to survive the best are the ones that have pathways to move within, to be able to get from habitat to habitat, get from area to area, and those that have places to go that have high climate change resilience. And so that's the importance of why we're trying to accomplish with the prairie plan in light of a changing climate, is to be able to provide those places and to provide those corridors that plants and animals are going to need. So with that, I'll end my presentation, and I think both Greg and I are be willing to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, gentlemen. Council, any questions about the plan or whatever else has been said here?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Representative Beckerfin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would just ask staff, a link to this information that's part of the presentation would be an important thing to make available to folks outside of, as well as us, but outside of this room.
Very good point. You raised a question with me, and that is you touched on grazing as a private enterprise that could help with prairies, et cetera. Often wondered, as somebody once told me, if an Iowa farmer could make as much money with pheasants that he does with corn, we'd have an oversupply of pheasants. So my question is, maybe we need to explore more about how we can get the private enterprise, that landowner, involved in prairies as somehow as an income stream for him or her, or some other reason why he's part of the team instead of, we always send government out to buy, as if they can't help more. Anyway, and there may not be an answer, but I'd be curious about your observations.
Well, one of the things that I can say about that is that we agree completely, and there's a lot of people that are working on the Prairie Plan that agree completely that is going to be the key of how we're going to be able to maintain a lot of the grasslands in Minnesota. Towards that end, one of the things neither Greg or I mentioned is how we're actually implementing the Prairie Conservation Plan. We have 8 different what we call local technical teams. These are teams of people in these prairie landscapes, these core areas out there that work together that include all of the conservation groups, all of the conservation agencies that meet locally on a regular basis, at least once or twice a year, to talk about how we can accomplish conservation. A key topic right now on most of these LTTs is talking about how we can get what we're calling landscape grazing. That is to say, across ownership boundaries, how can we can get grazing that on public and private lands that accomplish what Greg was talking about, of getting a diverse mixture of habitats and appropriate rest with that grazing, and in the process of doing, opening up a lot of these public conservation lands to private grazing. So that's a goal of what we'd hope to accomplish, and I think we're starting to make some inroads on it. It's still early in that process, but hopefully in 5 years we'll have some really good success stories to talk about.
Yeah, and then Chair and members, kind of the science behind grazing is really changing in the last decade or so. Conservationists have been beating up on cowboys for decades. A lot of that's coming from BLM land out in Nevada, Utah, where we probably shouldn't be grazing. Here we're talking about deep soils, humid climates, and very productive ecosystems. I know some of the work that's been done, Kansas, Oklahoma. There's been a complete shift that the ecological community is fully on board with grazing now, done in certain ways. I can still show you pastures in Minnesota that are grazed down to pool tables every year. That's not what we're talking about with conservation grazing, or definitely not with public lands grazing. But the amount of research that's coming out, in the last 10, 15 years is just overwhelming on the science behind the benefits of grazing for both the prairie and for prairie wildlife when it's done thoughtfully. And it's not the ranchers are not taking a hit. This is anecdotal information. I know talking to some of the producers or ranchers who have grazed public lands in Minnesota, because those lands have been rested for so long, the nutrition in the vegetation is so high. Some of them have told me they're seeing a 50-pound weight gain in their calves compared to the home pasture, which has been grazed every year. The other thing we really like to see with the conservation grazing and the public lands grazing is you've got the public lands, which don't get disturbed enough. You got the private pastures over here, which are probably getting disturbed maybe a little too much. So if you take the cattle off here and put them over here, you're adding the disturbance here. You're getting some rest on this private pasture. Yes, that is benefiting the landowner, but you're also getting you're basically getting a 2-for-1 wildlife habitat benefit by resting this property over here. Pheasants are going to fly back and forth between property lines. So yeah, I could go on for hours about the new science around grazing, but the numbers are out there, and if implemented properly, we can see some really amazing benefits, both ecologically and, as Steve was getting at, economically out in rural Minnesota.
All right, thank you. Any other questions, Council? If not, thank you, gentlemen. And we're at the top of the hour almost. How about a 15-minute break? Does that work for everybody? All right, I'll see you back here in 15 minutes.